Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and today, as an intro to this week's Vintage Cube on Rough Drafts, we are going to do a bit of a countdown of my top 10 combos in Vintage Cube. So this list is very subjective. This is my personal list. You'll probably disagree with some of them, and honestly, they are really hard to rank. It's hard to really put one over another. So make sure to shout out in the comments if there's a combo I missed, or if you disagree with the rankings. But anyway, let's talk about my top 10 combos in Vintage Cube, and then up next we will have this week's Vintage Cube draft on Rough Drafts. Anyway, before we get to the countdown, quick shout out to the fast mana. This is what makes the Vintage Cube, the Soul Rings, the Black Lotus, the Mana Crypt, the Mox Jet, all the other fast artifact mana. This is also what allows there to be so many broken, insane combos in Vintage Cube, because things can just happen so much more quickly in Vintage Cube than in other cube formats. That is the joy of a powered cube. So, while this isn't a combo in and of itself, these cards make a lot of the other combos way faster and more efficient and better than they would be in other formats. So, on to the list. Number 10, we have Splinter Twin Combo. So, Splinter Twin Combo, I might be underrating a little bit. It might deserve to be higher on the list, but my problem with the Splinter Twin Combo is twofold. I'll get to that in a second. First off, in case you're not familiar somehow with the most popular combo in Modern, the basic idea is to get a Splinter Twin or a Kiki-Jiki the Mirror Breaker on the battlefield at the same time as a Pestermite or Deceiver Exarch. And if you get both halves of the combo on the battlefield, you get to make infinite Pestermites or Deceiver Exarchs, and in theory, just win the game on the spot by making a million creatures and attacking. So that's the combo. The reason I put it at number 10 and not higher is, first off, it's a creature-based combo, which means something as simple as a Swords to Plowshares or an Abrupt Decay ends your fun. The other reason it is low on the list is because there aren't many redundant pieces. As you'll see, as we move through this list, a lot of the combos are like, you get one card and you put a bunch of mana rocks around it and you have a combo. Or at least a synergy. Maybe I'm using the term combo too loosely, but that's how a lot of the combos work. There's a lot of redundancy if you get a specific card. In the Splinter Twin combo, you need to have both halves to the combo, and either half individually is pretty bad on its own. Splinter Twin and Kiki-Jiki are basically unplayable unless you have a Pestermite or Deceiver Exarch, and Deceiver Exarch and Pestermite are, I guess, maybe passable, but definitely not good in Vintage Cube unless you have the Splinter Twin or Kiki-Jiki. So I definitely have drafts where I highly pick a Splinter Twin or Kiki-Jiki and never get a Deceiver Exarch or Pestermite, or highly pick a Pestermite or Deceiver Exarch and never get the Splinter Twin or Kiki-Jiki. So that is why I'm putting Splinter Twin at number 10 on my list of the top 10 combos in the Vintage Cube. Number 9, we have my personal favorite combo. I'm probably overrating this combo, but I had to sneak it on the list. I love Winter Orb. Winter Orb is this crazy artifact that says players can only untap one land during each untap phase. So pretty much you put a big pinch on mana. Probably the simplest way to break this card is with artifact mana. If you can have a bunch of Signets or Mana Elves or Moxen that untap every turn while your opponent doesn't, you break the symmetry and you're getting 5 or 6 mana a turn while your opponent's getting 1 mana a turn. But there's a couple cards that work really well with this plan, the Winter Orb plan. One is Goblin Welder, which allows you to sack an artifact to get an artifact back from the graveyard. So with the Goblin Welder and a Winter Orb, basically what you can do is you can get all your mana every other turn, while your opponent never gets to untap more than one land. So you can, on your opponent's turn, like on their end step, tap the Welder, sack the Winter Orb, assuming you have another artifact in your graveyard, get that artifact back. That allows you to untap all your lands on your untap phase, and then during your main phase, you can tap the Goblin Welder again, sack the artifact, get back the Winter Orb, and your opponent doesn't get to untap. So you can do that every other turn. You can get all your mana while your opponent is still constantly pinched with only one land. Ral Zarek synergizes in a different way. His +1 ability says tap a target permanent, then untap another target permanent. First off, the untap another target permanent means you can untap a second land underneath the Winter Orb. So you get to untap one on your upkeep, and you can untap another one with Ral Zarek. So you're untapping 2 lands a turn, while your opponent's only untapping 1. But the other half of Ral Zarek's +1 also works really well, because one of the common ways an opponent will try to get out from under the Winter Orb block is to store up their mana. They'll untap a land, pass the turn, untap another land, pass the turn, eventually try to store up 3, 4, 5 mana, and play a spell that can get rid of the Winter Orb or get them out from under that lock. Well, Ralzeric, by tapping their land that they untap every turn, makes sure that your opponent is always stuck on 1 mana, and it's really hard for them to deal with the Ralzeric when they only have 1 land. So all around, Ralzeric is just built for Winter Orb decks. So number 9 combo in the Vintage Cube, Winter Orb Lock. Number 8, we have Signets and Spells, I'm calling it. Basically, I had a hard time breaking this one down into a specific deck or combo, but there is a Signet deck that plays and Signets are a stand-in for all the different mana rocks. These are maybe the most common ones because it's a cycle of 10, but basically artifact mana, play as much of it as you can, then play spells that break the symmetry, or play spells that work really well with the artifact mana. So we have, for example, Wildfire and Burning of Zenge. They're the same card. Each player sacrifices 4 lands, and Wildfire deals 4 damage to each creature. So if you have a bunch of artifact mana, and you cast a Burning of Zenge, in theory, you will destroy all your lands, destroy all your opponent's lands, but you don't care that your lands are destroyed, because you still have this artifact mana to untap with, so it's another way to break the symmetry of these symmetrical spells. Balance, same thing. It causes players to sack lands down to the least amount of lands a player controls. It causes them to discard cards the same way and sack creatures the same way. So if you can have a bunch of Moxen and Signets and artifact mana sources, but only a couple of lands, and your opponent is on the play lands every turn for mana plan, you can break the symmetry of balance and hurt your opponent way more than it hurts you, even though it's a symmetrical spell. Finally, the big daddy of the bunch, Upheaval. Upheaval is insane. The basic idea with Upheaval is you want to cast it with maybe like 12 mana, as much mana floating as possible. Then you bounce everything, and since it's a sorcery, this is during your turn, so you bounce everything, and since you have that mana floating, you get to replay all your Signets and your Moxen, and maybe even some creatures or Planeswalkers, and then you pass the turn to your opponent, and what your opponent does after an Upheaval, most of the time, is play a land, go to their cleanup phase, discard like 10 cards, and pass the turn. So you untap your next turn with like 6 mana, maybe a Planeswalker, some creatures. Your opponent has 1 land in play and just discarded all their battlefield. It is completely busted. Such a powerful spell, especially in the Signet and Spells ramp strategy. So number 8, Signet and spells that work with the synergy of artifact mana. Number 7, we have Reanimator. For me, the big one is Griselbrand. I think that is clearly the best target for reanimating in Cube. So basically what you want to do with Reanimator is get a Griselbrand on the battlefield as fast as possible. And the best way to do this is turn 1 Entomb. And if you have a Mox Jet or some other mana source like that, you can Entomb, put Griselbrand in your graveyard, into Reanimate Griselbrand, immediately draw 7, draw some counter spells and whatever, protect the Griselbrand. Basically, it's a way you can win the game on turn 1. Even if you don't have a Mox, you can Entomb on the end of your opponent's turn to put a creature in your graveyard, then untap, Reanimate, you get a Griselbrand on turn 2. I know it's a little slow, but trust me, in Limited, a turn 2 Griselbrand is still pretty tough to beat. So number 7 on our list of best combos in Vintage Cube, Reanimator. Number 6, we have the infinite combo of Vintage Cube. If you assemble this cube, it is probably the most powerful combo in Cube. It is both infinite mana and infinite life. And if you can't figure out a way to win the game with infinite mana and infinite life, maybe you should find another game to play, I don't know. But basically, this combo should win the game. The reason it comes in at number 6 and not higher is it is a 3-piece combo, and none of the pieces are particularly good on their own. So it's a little risky to try to put together. You don't want to first pick a Zurin Orb and just trust that you're going to find a Fast Bond and a Crucible. While it is true that those cards come around fairly late, not all the cards in the cube are in each draft. So there's a chance you can first pick a Zurin Orb and later find out that Fast Bond was never even in any of the packs in your cube. So there's no chance that you could get it. But basically how this works is you get a Crucible of Worlds on the battlefield, which lets you play lands from your graveyard. You get a Fast Bond on the battlefield, which lets you play any number of lands per turn, but you have to pay 1 life, or it does 1 damage to you for each land beyond the first. And then you get a Zurin Orb on the battlefield, which lets you sacrifice a land to gain 2 life. So, with all 3 of these cards together, what happens is you can tap a land to add a mana, sack the land to Zurin Orb to gain 2 life, then replay the land with Fast Bond at the cost of 1 life, but you're still up 1 life because of Zuran Orb, and you get that untapped land back on the battlefield thanks to Crucible of Worlds, letting you play lands from your graveyard. You can tap it again, sack it again. So basically, every time you go through this iteration, you gain 1 life and net 1 mana. And if you have 10 lands on the battlefield, you can do it with all of them. Tap all your lands, sack all your lands, gain 20 life, pay 10 life to get those lands back from the graveyard untapped, thanks to Fast Bond and Crucible of Worlds, and do it again. So basically, infinite mana, infinite life, you figure out how to win the game later. So number 6 combo in Vintage Cube, going infinite with Crucible of Worlds, Zuran Orb, and Fast Bond. Number 5, this is another one of my personal favorites. Might be overrating it a little bit, but Mindslaver locking people is awesome in Vintage Cube. Mindslaver is a card that I've been super impressed with in Limited. People tend to let it go really late, but it's actually really powerful. My win percentage when I resolve a Mindslaver in Cube events is extremely high. So the basic way you do this, the most common way, is to get up to 13 mana. Then you have an Academy Ruins, and you can sack the Mindslaver. So it costs 6 to cast, you can pay 4, sack it, and take control of target player's next turn. Then you use Academy Ruins, you can pay 1 and a blue, tap it, put an artifact from your graveyard, which in this case would be Mindslaver, on top of your library. And then you draw the Mindslaver again, play it, sack it, take the next turn, and eventually figure out how to kill your opponent. And then you also get Duretti Scrap Savant, which isn't infinite with Mindslaver, but it's worth mentioning because it is a way to buy back a Mindslaver a couple times. So Duretti, the problem is it only comes in with 3 loyalty, but it has a -2 where you can sacrifice an artifact to get an artifact back from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you can sack a random Signet or something to get back a Mindslaver, immediately sack the Mindslaver, but then you'd have to pump up the Duretti to be able to do it again. So basically you can use Duretti every other turn, can Mindslaver, unless you pump it up a bunch before you start going into the combo. If you get it up to like 7 or 9 loyalty, then you could Mindslaver many times in a row just with Duretti sacking artifacts. Number 4 on our list of Vintage Cube combos is cheat Emrakul into play. So Emrakul is the biggest and the baddest thing you can do in Cube. It is really hard to lose a match once you get an Emrakul on the battlefield, even if it's only for 1 turn. So one of my favorite things to do in Cube is pick an Emrakul early in pack 1, and then look for ways to get it on the battlefield. And these are just a few of the ways that you can do that. We have Show and Tell, lets each player put an artifact, creature, enchantment, or land from their hand on the battlefield. So yes, it's symmetrical, but you're putting an Emrakul into play, and nothing is symmetrical when it comes to Emrakul. If you are putting Emrakul into play, no matter what your opponent is putting into play, you are putting the more powerful card into play, so it's a net gain. Through the Breach, Show and Tell lets Emrakul stick around. Through the Breach lets you one-shot with Emrakul. So you can take and cast Through the Breach, you put the Emrakul into play with haste, get to attack with it, and then it dies, and when it dies it shuffles everything back into your graveyard. So eventually you can draw the Through the Breach and the Emrakul and do it all over again. Eureka is probably the most risky way to do this. Eureka basically lets both players empty their hands of permanents. You put a permanent onto the battlefield, your opponent does. You do, your opponent does. So even with just an Emrakul, it is possible that your opponent could have some combination of cards that would be better. That's why Eureka is thought of as a trap card to some extent. But if you know you have the best cards to put on the battlefield, like your opponent's playing White Weenie, or you resolve to Thoughtseize to see your opponent's hand, then you're pretty safe to Eureka with impunity because you know that you're going to come out ahead in that exchange. So number 4, combo in Vintage Cube, cheat Emrakul into play. Number 3, we have every streamer's favorite deck, Storm. So Storm and Cube, there are 3 Storm cards. There are Brain Freeze and Empty the Warrens. As you can see there, Brain Freeze mills for 3, and you get to copy it with Storm for each spell you played before it this turn. Empty the Warrens makes 2 1/1 red goblins, has Storm, so you copy it for each spell played before it this turn. And then there is also Tendrils of Agony, which does 2 damage, and you gain 2 life, so it drains for 2, basically, and it also has Storm. So the idea with Storm is you want to play as many spells as possible, which actually isn't that hard to do if you build around it, thanks to Artifact Mana, Dark Ritual, Gush, and so on. The thing with Storm is, though, the downside of Storm is there are so few Storm cards. So for me, if I'm going to try to be the Storm deck, I want to already have a Storm card. I've had drafts where I think I'm going to be the Storm deck. I start taking Dark Rituals and Gushes and Ponders and all the stuff that would go well in a Storm deck. only to never get an actual Storm card, which leaves you with this deck that can draw a ton of cards and play a ton of spells, but can't actually win the game. So it's a little risky to go in on the Storm deck without having a card that literally says Storm on it. But once you get a Storm card, you get to take advantage of some really powerful cards that a lot of other decks don't want to play. There's a bunch of draw 7s in the cube between Memory Jar, Wheel of Fortune, Time Twister. These are cards that are awesome in cube because they let you refill your hand and keep playing spells. And there's also a lot of super powerful black draw spells like Necropotence and Yawgmoth's Bargain, which allow you to draw sometimes 10 or more cards in one turn by paying life. So these are cards that often come around pretty late in packs because your typical deck really can't take advantage of them, but the Storm deck is built to take advantage of this big influx of cards and to win on one big turn. So once you get the Brain Freeze or the Empty or the Tendrils, then you can start going deep and take advantage of some of these late picks that no one else really wants. Number 2 combo in Vintage Cube, the classic vintage combo of Tinker into Blightsteel. So Tinker lets you sack an artifact to search your library for an artifact, put it on the battlefield. Blightsteel, it's just 11/11, trample, infect, indestructible. So basically you can go like turn 1, land, Mox, Tinker for Blightsteel, next turn you attack for 11 infect damage, win the game. There's also bonus points if you get Lightning Greaves, which gives a creature haste and Shroud. It can't be targeted by spells or abilities. So you can play a Lightning Greaves on turn 2, for example, or turn 1 off a Mox. On turn 2, Tinker, sacking the Mox, get the Blightsteel, give it haste, attack for 11 infect, win the game. So it is a super powerful combo. Tinker is a card that, if you get it early, you should probably take it and build around it. It's so good. It is a busted ability to have access to. And finally, number 1. And this one is number 1 for 2 reasons. Not only is this combo classic, and it's been around since the very beginning of the game, it is also one of the hardest to beat if you can do it on turn 1. So we are talking about Channel on turn 1, off of Black Lotus, into something like Crater's Claws or Emrakul. So Channel is this green spell, costs 2 green mana. Once it resolves, you can pay 1 life to add 1 colorless mana. With a Black Lotus, you can cast Channel on turn 1 and have not only an untapped land, but a mana floating, which allows you to Crater's Claw or some other X-Burn spell for a full 20 damage on turn 1 before your opponent ever gets a chance to play a land or play a spell or do anything. Turn 1 on the play, this can win you the game. Emrakul is almost as good. If you channel into Emrakul on turn 1, it's not just unbeatable. You get to take another turn, attack for 15. It's possible your opponent could go land Mox into Balance and get rid of the Emrakul, but it's still, in most situations, a turn 1 Emrakul is going to close out the game as well. So, number 1 combo in Vintage Cube. It might not be the best combo, but it's, like I said, it's classic, and it is the most unbeatable if you can do it on turn 1. It is Channel into Fireball or Emrakul. Anyway, those are my 10 top combos in Vintage Cube. Make sure to check out the Vintage Cube draft coming up next. It's possible that we have some of these combos in our deck, so you'll have to wait and see. Make sure to leave it in the comments. What's your favorite combo in Vintage Cube? What do you think of these rankings? Are they pretty close, or do you have a problem with any of them? Make sure to check out the website, mtggoldfish.com. Decks, prices, metagame strategy, pretty much everything and anything you need related to Magic the Gathering. And if you enjoyed the video, click the subscribe button that's about to pop up on the bottom of your screen. It'll keep you up to date on all the latest and greatest in video content from mtggoldfish.com. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this countdown of the top 10 combos in Vintage Cube, or my top 10 combos in Vintage Cube, and I will talk to you soon.